The zoo photo was introduced as part of Warren Commission Exhibit 282, which is a page from the February 21st, 1964 edition of Life magazine. And the caption underneath the photo in Life magazine says, "Truant at 13, Lee visits zoo in New York. He cut so many classes that he was in trouble with officials." Now, it seems strange to me that the Warren Commission would introduce this photograph into evidence through Life magazine when you consider that they had this very photograph in front of them 2 weeks earlier when Marguerite Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, was testifying. She had this photo with her, and I think it's interesting the way they treat this photo. The Chief Counsel Rankin says, "If you will permit me, I will ask the court reporter to identify these pictures, and I don't intend to offer them. But then I will ask you each one by numbers so we can make it clear, and then return them to you, so you can tell us what they are about. Is that all right with you?" So what he's saying here is he's going to assign exhibit numbers to these photos, just so he can refer to the photos, and then he's not going to enter these into evidence and just give them back to Mrs. Oswald, and that's what he does. "Now, Mrs. Oswald, I will hand you exhibits 259 through 269, both inclusive, and ask you to take them starting with exhibit 259 and referring to the exhibit in each case, tell the commission what the picture is about." So here he's assigning exhibit numbers to them. But if you go look for these exhibit numbers now, you'll see they don't exist because he gives the photos back to the witness. And then when Mrs. Oswald gets to the photo in question, she says, "This is a picture of Lee at the Bronx Zoo, exhibit 261, age 13. That is the Bronx Zoo in New York?" "Yes, sir." "That is the Bronx Zoo in New York that you told us about?" "Yes, sir." And she had mentioned earlier in the testimony that Lee would skip school and go to the zoo. So that's the picture we're in question, exhibit 261. But again, if you go look for exhibit 261, it doesn't exist because they give the photos back to her. And here's where they give the pictures back to her. To me, this just sounds laughable. I mean, they've given them exhibit numbers, and now Rankin says, and that now exhibits 259 to 269, both inclusive, are those all the pictures that you are offering the commission this morning? I have many more pictures I will be happy to show you, but these are the pictures that your Mr. Jennet said he would like to have for the commission. And that you were referring to when you offered them to the commission? Yes. Thank you very much, and we would like to return them to you at this time. And then Earl Warren says, "We will return them to you, Mrs. Oswald." That is all I have, Mr. Chairman. So they're really making a point about this, that they're giving her back her photos. And the very next day after Mrs. Oswald testified, on February 13th, Mr. John Doyle called and said he had a call from Mrs. Oswald advising she is missing a couple of her papers. So the very next day, Mrs. Oswald is complaining that something of hers is missing. Now, Mr. John Doyle is her attorney for when she appears before the Warren Commission, but he is not her personal attorney. He was selected for her at the request of the Warren Commission. The commission asked the District of Columbia Bar Association. It designated John F. Doyle, formerly of Kansas City, a highly regarded Washington lawyer and a former assistant U.S. Attorney General. So Mrs. Oswald's attorney is an insider, a Washington insider. And apparently Wesley Liebler of the Warren Commission Council Group was put on to this job. He's the writer of this memo. He says, "I discussed the matter with Rankin on the telephone, with Mr. Schaefer in person, and decided that Mr. Doyle and I should go to Mrs. Oswald's hotel room, taking with us copies of each of the documents which Mrs. Oswald had made available to us for copying. We did this at about 6 p.m. Mr. Spector accompanied us." So Arlen Specter, Wesley Liebler, and Mr. Doyle, the Washington insider lawyer, all go to Mrs. Oswald's hotel room. So with all three of them there, they go to Mrs. Oswald's room and they rifle through all of her documents, and they discover the documents that she thought were missing, or the document she thought was missing. And Arlen Specter signs the honesty pledge. The above memorandum accurately reflects the events which occurred at a conference held in Mrs. Marguerite Oswald's room in the Hotel Willard, which began at approximately 6 p.m. February 13th, 1964. What I think happened here is that the Warren Commission wanted the original photo. There's something about it. They wanted it to disappear, and I think that Liebler, Specter, and Doyle were sent to go get it. Doyle, her chosen lawyer, probably somehow set her up to notice a missing document, which Liebler and Specter brought with them and pretended to find in her papers while they removed the zoo photo. I think probably written on the zoo photo is some sort of identifying information, like perhaps the date it was taken, that they don't want to be known, and therefore I think they wanted the original to disappear. And I think they set up this encounter in Mrs. Oswald's hotel room to grab the photo. And the topic of the zoo photo came up in the testimony of Robert Oswald, Lee Oswald's brother. And they're talking about the period in the summer of 1953 when Robert Oswald visited Lee and his mother in New York City. Did you have an occasion during that period to take any photographs, snapshots of Lee? I certainly can identify the one appearing in Life. Yes, sir, I did. Just hold your answers right in this area exactly to my questions. I'm sorry. Now, I think what this demonstrates is that Robert Oswald is eager to answer this question, and that means that he has already discussed this with Mr. Jenner before his testimony, and that he has agreed, falsely I believe, to take credit for taking that photo in the summer of 1953. I think that's the point here. They're trying to establish that this photo was taken in 1953. And I think it's important to note that Alan Dulles perked up his ears at this point. Were these taken with your camera, or was it a camera that your mother or brother owned or had? This was my camera. Mr. Dulles, what do these questions refer to? Do they refer to the pictures in Life? Now, I think he might have been kind of snoozing here and just waiting for this moment because this is very important to him. I think he has a reason to be interested in the zoo photo. And then Robert Oswald takes credit for the photo and establishes on the record that he took that photo in the summer of 1953, which I think is exactly what the Warren Commission wants to hear. I think they engineered this answer. I think they discussed this with Robert Oswald before, and that he agreed to say that, even though it wasn't true. And I have to note, of course, that Life magazine also says this is it doesn't say it's 1953. It says that Oswald is 13, and that if it's in the summer, that would have to be 1953. So it was already published in Life magazine as being the summer of 53, essentially. And this photo had been published earlier than this. It had been published at least by December 15th, as this old press photo demonstrates. So this date, which I think is a lie, of being in 1953, it's not a new lie. It's a lie that's been around. And I don't know how this lie was engineered. I'm assuming that Marguerite Oswald is not in on the lie, because then they wouldn't have had to take the photograph from her. I'm assuming that Alan Dulles or whoever has his tentacles into the media and is able to control things to an extent. And I think Mrs. Oswald's testimony was altered about the date of the photo. And these two photos side by side are very convenient to illustrate the point that I'm getting at here, which is Oswald does not look old enough in the zoo photo for that to be 1953. On the left, this is Oswald in the second grade. They don't say what grade he's in on the right, but if you're in the second grade, you're about 7 years old. And we know when he was supposed to be in New York in 1953, he would have been 13, soon to be 14. So we're supposed to believe that the picture on the left was taken 6 years prior to the picture on the right. And I don't think that's credible. Maybe 2, maybe 3 years, but not 6 years. Fairly recently, this photo has shown up in some news stories. I forget when this is from. I think it was 2017. And there's several different publications that use this. They all seem to be the same story. They all say it's 1947. The ones that say so say it came from, quote, the family. And it says it's at the Bronx Zoo in New York. Well, it can't be 1947 because he's certainly not... he might be 8 years old, I suppose, but he has no reason to be in New York City in 1947. And I don't think he's 8 years old there either. I think he's older than that. But that's the problem. The only reason on the record we have for Oswald being in New York City prior to 1962 is that in 1945, he and his mother and Ekdahl, Edwin Ekdahl, the man she married, they all went, according to Robert Oswald, at least they all went to Boston for 6 months to visit the family up there. So there's no reason in the official story for Oswald to be in New York City prior to 1953, and certainly not after 1948 when the Oswalds were divorced, because that was supposed to be the end of the Ekdahl affair. I don't think it's ever explicitly stated in the evidence, but the assumption seems to be that after the divorce, nobody ever saw Ekdahl again. That is, that the Ekdahl relationship completely ended between Ekdahl and the Oswalds. And in fact, Ekdahl's family was asked by the FBI after the assassination if they had ever heard of the Oswalds. And the son, whom they supposedly spent 6 months with in 1945 over Christmas, the son had never heard of them. He knew there was a new wife, but he didn't know her name, and he never met them, which doesn't make sense if they spent 6 months living together. And, of course, Fred Korth was Edwin Ekdahl's divorce lawyer when he divorced Marguerite. Fred Korth, after John Connally resigned the position, became JFK's Secretary of the Navy. Edwin Ekdahl's divorce lawyer became Secretary of the Navy. And Ekdahl worked for Ebasco Services, a big government contractor, a really big contractor. And Ebasco was unable to tell the FBI anything significant about Edwin Ekdahl, which is pretty strange, too. So there's a lot of good reasons, I think, to be suspicious of the relationship between Edwin Ekdahl and Lee Harvey Oswald, and the date of this zoo photograph is very important in determining whether that relationship continued beyond 1948, the date of the divorce. And these two quotations from Marguerite Oswald's sister and a friend imply that the relationship continued until Mr. Ekdahl died. And if that's the case, then it's certainly being hidden in the official story. And I think that is important because if that relationship continues, it could be investigated, and perhaps it could be discovered that Ekdahl had intelligence connections and that Lee Harvey Oswald was being groomed by those intelligence connections. And I think that's what happened, and I think that's why the Warren Commission was playing games with the zoo photo, because they wanted to make it seem as though it was taken in 1953 when the Oswalds went to New York, presumably having nothing to do with Edwin Ekdahl, when in fact it was taken at an earlier time after the divorce, And it would prove, if that were known, that the relationship continued after the divorce.